On the night before the grand wedding, I no longer chased after Shen Yangqing asking all sorts of questions. Nor did I pester him to teach me those difficult poems and songs, and even stopped feeling secretly heartbroken because he and the princess were frequently in contact. He thought I had finally become sensible and started learning to be a well-read and reasonable good match. Actually, it was because I had secretly agreed that on the day of the grand wedding, I would let the princess take my place and become the bride. When it is Shen Yangqing's wedding night, that would be the time for me to leave Chang'an and regain my freedom. From then on, we would be worlds apart, you and I never to meet again. Please make sure you are in a comfortable position. Our main story is about to begin. Reply in the comments section and let us know which city you are all reading our story from the day before the grand wedding. Shen Yangqing was always restless. He finally opened his mouth and asked me, "If you've made the person you love angry, what should you do?" I was stunned for a moment, and an image of that stack of carefully preserved letters in his study surfaced in my mind. "Aching." Shen Yangqing's voice brought me back from my thoughts. He leaned against a corridor pillar, those eyes that were always calm and unruffled now unexpectedly revealing an anxiety I had never seen before. I hurriedly came back to my senses, my fingers unconsciously tightening their grip on my sleeve. "If you've made the person you love angry, what should you do?" He repeated it again, his voice lower than usual, carrying a trace of unconcealable urgency. I lowered my eyelids, not daring to look directly at the anticipation in his eyes. "Send some pastries, or exquisite hairpins and rings. If not that, then accompany her for a stroll in the market." My answer was pitifully simple, even seeming a bit clumsy. Shen Yangqing's expression indeed dimmed, and the habitual gentle smile on his lips also faded a bit. I understood he was disappointed. How could a noble and precious princess care for such ordinary things? "Thank you." He thanked me softly, turned and went back to the study, gently closing the door. I stood on the spot, listening to the sound of pages turning inside the room, and suddenly recalled the scene of when I first met Shen Yangqing in my childhood. That year I was 8, my hometown was hit by a flood. The previous year's harvest had been poor, and the granaries were already completely empty. Mother gave me a bag of silver fragments and sent me to town to buy seeds. Clutching the bag of silver, I made my way through the bustling crowd, but then I saw Shen Yangqing at the slave market. The 11-year-old boy stood on a high platform bound in shackles, and though his clothes were covered in dust, his back was still straight. A broker was roughly yanking his top knot for the buyers to inspect, his brows furrowed in pain, but he gritted his teeth and didn't make a sound. "That is the young master of the Shen family." An auntie beside me sighed. "Lord Shen was wrongfully imprisoned, the family property was confiscated, the men were exiled, the women were enslaved, and only this child is left to be sold." Sunlight shone on his face, his eyelashes casting a shadow beneath his eyes. So handsome he looked like a celestial boy from a picture book. By the time I came to my senses, I had already handed all the broken silver in my hand to the broker. When I led Shen Yangqing home by the hand, Dad's tobacco pipe almost fell to the ground. "You went to buy seeds and bought a person back?" Dad was so angry he kept stamping his feet. Mom wiped her tears looking at the empty rice jar at home. And in the end, we only got through that year by borrowing grain from all over. This debt, my family spent a whole 6 years paying it back. When Shen Yangqing first came, he was very pampered. I dressed him in Dad's old clothes. His delicate skin was chafed bright red by the coarse cloth. He couldn't swallow the plain food, refusing to pick up his chopsticks even when his stomach ached from hunger. At night I slept on a straw pallet and gave him the bed, but he caught a fever in the drafty room and started talking deliriously. The hardest part was that he wanted to study. Dad said, "What is the point of putting on airs when we've been reduced to servants?" So he squatted by the stove every day, practicing his writing in the stove ash with a fire poker. One time I returned from gathering firewood and saw his fingers were pricked by splinters and speckled with blood, yet he was still persisting with his writing. "You are so stupid." I snatched the firewood stick away and used the egg money I'd saved for over half a year to get him a brush, ink, paper, and an inkstone. The light that lit up in his eyes made me feel that going hungry was also worth it. Gradually, he learned to wrap his hands with rags to continue chopping firewood, could swallow wild vegetable congee without batting an eye. And when he helped me mend clothes, his stitches were even neater than mine. The girls in the village all envied me, saying Shen Yangqing treated me extremely well. That wasn't untrue either. I cut my hand while reaping grass, and he went into the mountains overnight to pick hemostatic herbs. I was so tired from carrying firewood that I couldn't even straighten my back. And he took all of it without a second word. I said I liked the wild lilies on the other side of the mountain. And the next day, there would surely be a dewy flower stem on the stove, with even the thorns carefully removed. But whenever I tried to get a little closer, he would always subtly take half a step back, like a green bamboo growing on a cliff, visible but unreachable. I once naively thought that he was just naturally indifferent and not good at getting close, that he was just politely keeping his distance from everyone, just like the moonlight shining equally on everyone. Maidservants and attendants, neighborhood children, even the beggars on the roadside could all receive his perfectly measured gentleness. But that was all. He wouldn't get particularly close to anyone, nor would he care about anyone in particular. I had even secretly rejoiced, thinking that at least he was like this with others too, that I wasn't the only one he kept at a polite distance. Until yesterday morning when I unintentionally saw those letters, a full 99 of them, each one treasured and carefully stored by him, neatly arranged by date. Princess Mirong's handwriting was elegant with a hint of dainty pride, from the initial polite greetings to the later pouty complaints. The lines were filled with a young girl's thoughts, and Shen Yangqing's draft replies were always restrained and polite, maintaining an appropriate distance, until the most recent letter from the princess, which had only a few sparse words. This princess is angry, I don't want to deal with you anymore. Then there was his figure, sleepless all night, cast upon the window paper, and the panic I'd never seen before in his eyes this morning. I suddenly realized, this is what love is. It is not an impeccable gentleness, not a perfectly measured thoughtfulness, but tossing and turning all night over an angry remark. It is turning restraint into the repeatedly revised ink marks on paper. I closed my eyes, realizing this 10-year-long unrequited obsession had to come to an end. Number. Chapter 2. The moment of awakening just as I was about to turn and leave. The study door opened again. Shen Yangqing came out, holding a rolled-up scroll in his hand. He saw me still standing there, was slightly startled, then asked gently, "You, help me see what you think of this gift." He unrolled the scroll. It was a gongbi painting of peonies, painted with extreme detail, the dewdrops on the petals looking as if they would really roll off. I recognized this as the result of him staying up for several nights. At the time, I had even thought it was prepared for now, it seems. It was just my wishful thinking. Very beautiful, I said, my throat tightening. The princess likes peonies, he said softly, as if to himself. I just don't know if she'll find this painting too gaudy. I watched the expression on his face as he lowered his head to examine the painting. His eyelashes cast a shadow on his face, and the corners of his lips held an unconscious smile. At this moment, he was so alive, a completely different person from the always calm and self-possessed Shen Yangqing in my memory. I suddenly remembered when I was 15, I secretly embroidered a scented sachet for him. The stitches were crooked and messy. The embroidered koi fish looked like a tangled mess. I shoved it into his hands with a red face. He thanked me politely, and then the sachet was never seen again. At that time, I comforted myself, saying he just didn't like scented sachets. It wasn't until this moment, seeing Shen Yangqing so restless while preparing a gift for the princess, that I had a sudden realization. He just didn't like the person who gave him the sachet. The indifference I thought was his nature was only because the person who could fluster him wasn't me. I am going out for a walk, I said, my voice so soft it was almost inaudible. Shen Yangqing answered without even looking up. His entire focus was on that painting. Walking out of the Shen residence gate, the early summer sunlight stung my eyes. The streets were bustling with people coming and going. The cries of street vendors rose and fell. Everything was so lively, a stark contrast to my numb heart. I was walking aimlessly. A handmaiden dressed in brocade stopped me, curtsied. "Miss Han, my lady wishes to see you." In an elegant private room. Princess Murong was brewing tea. She sat by the window, sunlight sprinkled upon her through the thin gauze, her skin like the finest white porcelain. So beautiful it was dazzling. I involuntarily clutched the corner of my clothes. My rough fingers from years of labor created a few wrinkles on the soft, fine fabric, looking especially clumsy and laughable compared to the princess's slender, white jade-like hands. Standing in front of her, I was like a sparrow that had mistakenly stumbled into a phoenix's nest. "You are Miss Han." The princess's voice was as clear and melodious as a jade chime. Her gaze swept lightly over me with neither contempt nor jealousy, as if looking at an inconsequential object. I suddenly understood that in her eyes, I wasn't even qualified to be an opponent. This commoner has seen the princess. I bowed clumsily, my knees as stiff as if they had rusted. The princess lifted her chin slightly. "Sit." I had just sat down when a serving girl brought tea and snacks. The tea snacks were so exquisite I didn't even dare to pick them up with force for fear of being impolite. "I heard. You are the one who raised Shen Lang." I nodded, my throat tightening. "You've really gone through a lot." She set down her teacup, revealing a perfectly poised smile. "But Shen Lang is not who he used to be. Do you know that even His Majesty praised his Anbang Si during the imperial examination?" I shook my head. Shen Yangxing had never mentioned these things to me. "My royal father, the prince, is a reigning prince." The commandery princess slightly lifted her chin. "With just a word from me, Shen Lang could enter the Hanlin Academy next year. And you, what can you give him?" My fingers unconsciously caressed the rim of the teacup. "That is right. What can I give him? Except for hands full of calluses and a body reeking of everyday life." The commandery princess suddenly lowered her voice. "There is something else you might not know. The Shen family's crime back then was because they colluded with foreign enemies." My teacup fell onto the table with a clang. She gently stroked the golden hairpin by her temple, her crimson lips slightly parted. "However, I am my royal father's most beloved daughter. As long as I say a word, no one would dare to bring up these old cases. Shen Lang's future is up to me. If I am in a good mood, he could enter the cabinet and become a prime minister next year. If I am displeased." She paused meaningfully. "This case could be reopened at any time." She beckoned, and a maid walked over holding a brocade box. "Here are 500 taels of silver." The princess tapped the brocade box with her fingertip, the silver ingots gleaming under the sun, making one's eyes ache. "Enough for you to start a good life all over again." The gleam of the silver made my eyes sting, and in a daze I saw the back of Shen Yangqing as he hunched over his desk, studying hard, unwilling to put down his brush even when bitten by mosquitoes on summer nights, still persisting in practicing calligraphy even when his fingers were chapped in the harsh winter. 10 years of hard study in obscurity. He endured it, passing the imperial examinations with flying colors. He achieved it. This journey has been too bitter. He shouldn't be dragged down by me anymore. My fingers trembled slightly as they hovered above the silver ingots. We were supposed to be two parallel lines that would never intersect. A twist of fate entangled us for all these years, and now we are just returning to our rightful places. Besides, with this silver, Mom and Dad can finally live a good life. But in the end, I only picked up the smallest ingot. This is enough. I sighed. Shen Yangqing is yours now. Number Chapter 3, The Journey Home. Walking out of the tea house, I found myself by the river outside the city. This is a place I often come to whenever I feel oppressed in Chang'an. I would come here and stare blankly at the river. My face was reflected on the water's surface. Plain features, skin roughened by years of labor compared to the pampered and noble Princess Murong. It was like the difference between heaven and earth. I squatted down and stirred the reflection in the water with my hand. The reflection in the water was shattered and fragmented, and in a daze, it changed back into that barefoot fisher girl standing on the field ridge. I suddenly remembered what the old lady next door often said. A marriage between equals is like a well-fitting pair of shoes. No matter how far you walk, they won't chafe your feet. Perhaps I should go back to that small courtyard filled with drying fishing nets and find someone who can mend nets with me. He would always be with me, would share a single roasted sweet potato with me, and would scratch his head and grin foolishly while I count my copper coins. Just like how Dad was with Mom. Shen Yangqing is the moon in the sky, and I, this little fishing boat, can never moor on such a high shore. I was gazing at the reed marshes in the distant twilight when suddenly a familiar figure appeared on the water's surface, overlapping with my reflection. It was Shen Yangqing. He was standing on the riverbank just a few steps away, the hem of his bluish-gray long robe lifted by the wind. His eyes, which were usually gentle and composed, now seemed to be covered by a layer of gloom that wouldn't lift. He didn't speak, just quietly looked at me like that. I also didn't know what to say. After a long while, he finally spoke, his voice carrying an imperceptible tension. "This afternoon. Why did you go see the princess?" My fingertips paused for a moment on the cool surface of the water, just as I thought. Normally, no matter what I did, he was always gentle and composed. But whenever it involved Princess Murong, the turmoil in his eyes could not be hidden. I sighed and slowly turned around. I wanted to explain, but didn't know where to start. He was originally still frowning, as if he had more questions to ask. But when he saw the redness at the corners of my eyes, those words suddenly got stuck in his throat. He took half a step forward. The tension in his voice eased, tinged with a bit of helplessness. "Why are you crying?" I didn't speak. The tears didn't actually fall. It was just that the rims of my eyes were so sore it made me want to close my eyes. He reached out his hand to touch my cheek. His fingertips paused in midair. Then he drew it back, turning instead to gently hold my hand that was soaking in the water. His palm was always warm, but right now its warmth couldn't penetrate the cold in my heart. He is gentle. He softens his tone when he speaks, and he remembers all of my likes. But in this gentleness, there is just no love. I really want to ask him why he doesn't like me. But when the words were on the tip of my tongue, I still didn't ask. How should I say it? What is there to say? In the end, it would just be my own embarrassment. I lowered my head, looking at our clasped hands. His fingers were long and clean, and next to my hands that have worked for years, it was as if they were separated by clouds and mud. "Don't overthink it." He gently squeezed my hand, his voice softening even more. "We're getting married tomorrow." I still didn't say anything, just pulled my hand away. He looked at my dejected expression and suddenly sighed. "Let me take you to Wangyu Tower. Didn't you say you always wanted to see Chang'an at night?" Chapter 4. The last glance I froze for a moment. Wangyu Tower is the tallest building in Chang'an, and it is said that from there, you can overlook the lights of more than half the capital city. I had mentioned it offhandedly a few months ago. At that time, he was busy with work for the Ministry of Revenue and had just smiled and said, "Let's wait until I am through this busy spell." I thought he had long forgotten, so he still remembered. I nodded and followed him in the direction of Wangyu Tower. Before leaving, I should at least see the things I've always wanted to see. He walked very slowly the entire way, deliberately matching my pace. Occasionally, he would point to the shops on the roadside and share some amusing anecdotes, his tone as gentle as ever. But I just listened quietly, unable to feel any enthusiasm, only feeling that every step was exceptionally heavy. After climbing Wangyu Tower and seeing what I had wanted to see, I didn't feel the joy I had imagined. Suddenly, I asked him softly, "Shen Yangqing, do you still remember the first gift I gave you?" His expression faltered. He turned to look at me, his look strange for an instant before returning to normal, and said with a smile, "Of course, I remember. It was a sachet embroidered with a brocade carp." "Where is that sachet now?" I looked up at him, my gaze boring straight into his eyes. The smile on his face faded a bit, his gaze a little evasive, and he said vaguely, "Maybe it is in some box. I'll look for it later." I didn't ask further. I had already seen where that sachet was today. On Princess Murong's waist, tied with a tassel of the same color, was a koi with crooked and uneven stitches, looking particularly jarring on the luxurious fabric. "It is time to go back." I lowered my head and said, "He'll go find his Princess Murong, and I'll go back to my little fishing village." He probably noticed my mood was off, reached out and grabbed me, opened his mouth as if he wanted to say something, but in the end just sighed and repeated, Don't overthink it. We're getting married tomorrow. No one can separate us. No one can separate us. But I already don't want to marry him. I let him lead me back. The night grew darker. The lanterns by the roadside lit up one by one. The glow fell on his profile, still gentle. But I knew, some things, after all, had changed. Just like that sachet. From the very beginning he didn't like it. Back in the room, I packed my bundle. It is really nothing. Just a few changes of clothes and a little silver money I've saved up over the years. I just sat by the bed and waited like that, until the first light of dawn, when gongs and drums were roaring outside. And only then did I slip away in the chaos. Shen Yangqing, dressed in a bright red wedding robe, stood in the courtyard greeting guests, a rare hint of joy in his eyes. During the wedding ceremony, he thought he glimpsed a familiar green robe in the crowd, but when he looked again, there were only the bustling guests. He frowned slightly, thinking that perhaps he had been too busy these past few days, and his eyes were playing tricks on him. First bow to heaven and earth. He lowered his head to bow, but couldn't help glancing at the bride beside him from the corner of his eye. The figure under the red veil was slender and quiet, but for some reason, he kept feeling that something was off. Not until their wedding night did he pick up the ceremonial scale and gently lift her veil. Under the veil, Princess me.He gracefully raised her eyes, her red lips curving slightly. Shen Yangqing's hand trembled violently, and the ceremonial scale fell to the ground with a clatter. "Why is it you?" His voice suddenly turned cold, the smile in his eyes instantly freezing. "Where is Han Qing?" The princess unhurriedly smoothed the golden hairpin at her temple, she said. "She has already taken back from me the silver she spent supporting you all these years." She sighed softly, feigning regret. "She sold you to me." Shen Yangqing froze for a moment, and after it sunk in, he turned and rushed towards the door. Number. Chapter 5. New life on the wedding day. The residence was already bustling with activity before the sky had fully brightened. I peered through the window paper at the flickering shadows of people outside. The wedding matron's shrill voice pierced through the corridor. Time for the bride to do her hair and makeup. So I picked up the small bundle I had already packed and quietly pushed open the back door. The wooden door let out a creak. I held my breath and waited for a moment, and only when I was sure no one had noticed did I quickly walk outside. The morning fog was thick. I kept my head down and hurried through the alley, afraid of being recognized. In the bundle were only a few changes of clothes and the silver given by Princess me.He. It felt feather-light slung over my shoulder. When I reached the street corner, the carriage I had hired in advance was already waiting there. "Miss, are we heading south to Lan'an Prefecture?" the carriage driver asked, chewing on a grass stem. "No, to Qingshui town." I clutched the silver ingot in my sleeve. "I am going home." As the carriage passed through the city gate, the morning sun was rising from between the upturned eaves of the city tower. I looked back. Red silks were already hung in the direction of the Shen residence, and the festive sound of suonas could be heard from afar. I suppose by now, Shen Yangqing and Princess me.He must be performing their wedding ceremony. They should be very happy after they get married. After all, Shen Yangqing likes the princess so much. In the sound of wheels crushing gravel, I dazedly saw my 8-year-old self again. In the years of famine, I clutched the money for seeds. But at the slave market, as if possessed, I bought that handsome boy. At first, it was just that I coveted his good looks, like an immortal boy who had walked out of a picture book. Later, it was because he was different from all those reckless boys in the village, when other boys were shouting at the top of their lungs and rolling around in the dirt covered in mud. Only he was always neatly dressed, his cuffs stained with the faint scent of ink, always gentle and composed in his words and actions. He'd bring in my clothes for me on rainy days. He'd remember I like sweet kanji, and he'd subtly change the subject when Dad was scolding me. These small bits of kindness, like spring rain, seeped into my heart little by little. I don't know since when, but my face would turn red whenever I saw his hand holding a brush, and I couldn't help but peek my head out and look whenever I heard his footsteps. A young girl's feelings are like the tenderest willow buds in March, quietly sprouting in a corner unknown to anyone. Until he brought me into Chang'an, I was like a loach that had mistakenly gotten into a koi pond. I couldn't get a word in when the noble ladies talked about poetry, books, zithers, and paintings. When they covered their mouths to chuckle, I always suspected they were laughing at me for being crude and clumsy. Shen Yangqing was still gentle, but he was getting busier and busier. Sometimes I wouldn't see a shadow of him for several days. I gradually came to understand. The sky over Chang'an is too high, not a place a country sparrow like me can fly up to. Shen Yangqing was like that cold moon hanging in the 9 heavens. Its clear glow pure and bright, yet remote and unreachable. I've chased his shadow for too long, so long that my feet have been rubbed into blood blisters. So long that I've nearly exhausted the strength to even look up. The moon is always ahead, but I, after all, have to stop. The morning breeze blew open the carriage curtain, carrying the scent of soil and green grass. I spread open my palm, the silver ingot glinting faintly in the morning sun. Enough to get Dad a new hoe, and also to buy Mom a nice piece of fabric to make clothes. The undulating silhouette of the mountains in the distance was becoming more and more familiar. It is time for me to go home. There was no sky I couldn't reach, no cold moon to gaze up at, only the firm, warm earth and the door to my home, forever open for me. Number. Chapter 6. Mortal hearth and home returning to Qingshui town that day. I pushed open the familiar courtyard gate and walked right into Mom and Dad's astonished gazes. Dad's tobacco pipe hung in midair, its embers glowing and fading. Mom's sewing basket tilted in her hands, colorful threads spilling all over the floor. They froze for an instant, then immediately hurried forward. Mom grabbed my hand, her palm warm and rough. Dad stood behind her. His lips quivered, and in the end, he just sighed in a low voice. "It is good that you are back." Mom and Dad didn't ask about Chang'an, didn't mention the heartless person. They just turned and went to the kitchen to boil water and steam my favorite osmanthus cakes. The days just quietly continued on, as if I had only gone to the neighboring village to visit relatives. And now that I was back, everything was as usual. But I knew, even though they didn't ask, they were still worried deep down. I didn't say much either, just got up early every day to help Mom light the fire and cook. And in my free time, I would sit in the courtyard and embroider. Later, when I found an opportunity, I used the silver ingot that Princess Murong gave me to rent a small storefront at the busiest street corner in town. After Dad found out, he silently brought over some wood to help me build a counter. Mom dug out the patterned cloth from the bottom of her chest and sewed a shop banner for me. They don't ask anything. Just every time they pass by the shop, they always stand across the street and watch for a while. I know. They're afraid I can't get over it. Actually, there is really no need to worry now. Every day I have to go to the docks to pick up goods before dawn, attend to customers at noon, and go over the account books at night. I simply have no time to think about those things. The days passed by, plain and simple, and the worry in my mom and dad's eyes gradually faded. It is just that Mom started subtly mentioning young men around my age to me. I understood her intentions, but you can't force matters of the heart. Mom couldn't persuade me, so she just gently patted the back of my hand and, in the end, said nothing more. My little embroidery shop opened. That day, all the neighbors came to see the excitement. Zhou Jin, the young master of the Zhou family's cloth shop, stood at the back of the crowd holding several bolts of Suzhou satin, only coming forward after most of the people had dispersed. "Miss Han, my mom asked me to bring this." His voice wasn't loud, but the base of his ears turned red first. I touched the fine texture on the satin's surface. This fabric was much better than anything we currently had in our shop. "It is too precious." I was about to refuse, but then I saw him anxiously wringing his hands. "My mother said your embroidery is so good that this fabric wouldn't be wasted." Before he could finish, he started choking on his own saliva. After that, he always used the excuse of delivering fabric to come by. Sometimes he'd bring a bag of pine nut candy, other times a few wild rose branches. In any case, he would always come. I remember one time during a downpour, I was in the shop sketching a new pattern when I suddenly heard the door panel bang. Zhou Jin burst in, dripping wet all over, tightly clutching a stack of design papers to his chest. "It is raining so hard. Why did you come?" I hurriedly grabbed a dry cloth and handed it to him. But he was only focused on unfolding the design papers. The new embroidery patterns I promised you yesterday. I was afraid you'd be waiting anxiously. Under the candlelight, the sight of him looking down and twisting the corner of his clothes suddenly made my heart soften. This man was completely different from Shen Yangqing. Shen Yangqing's gentleness was like moonlight, kind to everyone, whereas Zhou Jin's warmth was like the fire in the stove, burning for me alone. Another time, I caught a cold, and Zhou Jin rode through the night to the county town to fetch a doctor. At the crack of dawn he returned, covered in mud, the skin on his forehead scraped, but the medicine packet was tucked into the dry inner flap of his clothes. I leaned against the headboard watching him squat in front of the stove, fumbling about as he brewed the medicine, the firelight reflecting on his tightly furrowed brow. "Does it hurt?" I was asking about the wound on his forehead. He shook his head and suddenly pulled an oil paper package from his bosom. "The medicine is bitter. Try this." Opening it, I discovered the candied fruit had already been soaked and swollen by the I pinched the softened candied date. But its rich, sweet flavor spread all the way to the bottom of my heart. Gradually, I also got used to him coming every day. He remembered every piece of fabric I praised, and would be sure to bring several more bolts next time. When he found out I liked apricot blossoms, he planted 2 trees in the backyard of the cloth shop. Once I casually mentioned that the sesame cakes from the south of the city were delicious. The next day I saw him standing in front of the shop, his head covered in morning dew, with a warm oil paper package tucked inside his clothes. Mom said the way Zhou Jin looks at me is like a starving wolf staring at a meat bun. I smiled and didn't say anything, but in my heart I knew clearly. What starving wolf? He is clearly just a silly dog that after getting a bone, can't wait to dig up its entire den for you. Later the Zhou family asked a matchmaker to come propose marriage, and I very naturally nodded and agreed. Number, Chapter 7. A life to look forward to. Our wedding was set for the 12th lunar month. On the day the betrothal gifts were presented, Zhou Jin, wearing a brand new indigo long gown, walked into the courtyard with his arms and legs moving on the same side. I hid behind the curtain to watch, and suddenly remembered the first time he came to deliver fabric, how he didn't even dare to step over the threshold. Silly look. I touched the hand warmer in my arms that he had secretly slipped to me this morning. The charcoal in the stove crackled once, just like my heartbeat at this moment. One day, news came from Chang'an the Shen family was number. That day I was in the embroidery workshop, embroidering my wedding dress when there was a sudden commotion outside. The neighbors were all talking, saying that Lord Shen was framed by a treacherous official back then, and now His Majesty has not only cleared the Shen family's name, but also let Shen Yangqing enter the Ministry of Personnel. When Zhou Jin hurriedly pushed the door and came in, I was embroidering the wedding dress. He stood at the doorway, the corner of his clothes still stained with dust from the road. His lips moved, but he didn't make a sound. I looked at his tightly clenched fists and the sweat on his temples, and suddenly I understood what he was worried about. "Come here." I put down my embroidery frame and beckoned to him. He shuffled over, but his eyes were fixed on the unfinished wedding dress on my table. "The golden thread for the wedding dress is almost used up." I looked at him. "If you are free this afternoon, go to town and bring some back for me. We still have to get married, you know, and it won't do if the wedding dress isn't finished." Realizing what I meant, Zhou Jin suddenly looked up, his eyes shining as bright as tempered stars. He opened his mouth, but in the end, just nodded heavily, reached out to take the ball of thread from my hand, and carefully started to separate the threads for me. The wind outside swirled a few fallen leaves past the stone steps, and the embroidery workshop was so quiet you could hear the faint sound of the silk threads rubbing as he separated them. I couldn't help but curve the corners of my lips, realizing that those days of chasing the moonlight were long gone, and the me of now was being properly warmed by the hearth and home of the mortal world. Although the days ahead are still long, it will no longer be me chasing the moonlight alone. 3 days before the wedding, Zhou Jin and I went to town to buy wedding candles. As we passed by a tea house, he suddenly squeezed my hand tight. Following his gaze, I saw Shen Yangqing walking out from a private room on the 2nd floor. The hem of his moon-white robes gently lifted by the wind, still as noble and refined as a banished immortal. Zhou Jin's palm started to sweat, and I gently squeezed his hand back, saying in a low voice, "It is okay. Shen Yangxing saw us, and his steps faltered slightly. His gaze lingered for a moment on my and Zhou clasped hands, then he showed that familiar, gentle smile. Han Qing, could I have a word with you? I told Zhou to go to the shop first and wait for me. The alley behind the tea house was very quiet, with only the rustling sound of the wind blowing through the willow branches. I heard you are getting married. I nodded. Then, do you really not want me anymore? His voice was tight, and the look in his eyes as he looked at me was very pitiful. I closed my eyes for a moment. I've already sold you to someone else. He suddenly grabbed my wrist. His strength was astonishing. This person, who was always composed, now had red-rimmed eyes. If back then young Master Shen. I gently pulled my hand away. What is past is past. Let's just let it go. He let go as if scalded, a broken smile pulling at the corner of his mouth. I've lost my composure. Sunlight cast mottled shadows on his face through the willow branches, and for the first time I clearly saw the discomfiture in his eyes. In the future, we don't need to see each other again. He has always been a decent man, so saying this much was already enough. I turned around to look for Zhou Jin. Zhou Jin was looking out from the shop's entrance. Seeing me coming, he hurried over to greet me. I reached out to brush the willow catkins off his shoulder. He froze for a moment, then immediately gripped my hand tightly. That palm was very rough, with some calluses, but it made me feel very secure. Chapter 8. The dust settles. Zhou Jin and I got married smoothly, and our days were simple and happy. Since that day, I have never seen Shen Yangqing again. It is just that sometimes in my dreams, I would vaguely see that boy standing under the crabapple tree at the academy. But when I opened my eyes, it was Zhou Jin's even breathing by my ear, his warm palm unconsciously resting on my waist, as if guarding the most precious treasure. On the day of Lichun, Zhou Jin left the house before the sky was bright. In the evening, he mysteriously covered my eyes and led me to the riverbank. When I opened my eyes, the entire Qingshui River was filled with floating flower lanterns. The candlelight reflected on the water's surface, like a handful of scattered gold fragments. What surprised me even more was, on every lampshade was embroidered a small portrait of me, one with my head down embroidering, one cooking in front of the stove, and another holding an oil paper umbrella, waiting for him in the rain. 9 lanterns. Zhou Jin's ear tips were bright red. From the age of 8 until this year, 1 lantern a year. He told me that we had actually first met at a temple fair when we were children. Back then, someone had snatched his sugar figurine, and it was me who, with my hands on my hips, scared off those naughty kids. He went red in the face but couldn't even utter a word of thanks. Yet he carried that gratitude with him for half his life, making up for it now. He suddenly straightened his attire and, like a young lad, gave me a deep bow. Thank you, my lady, for bravely coming to my rescue back then. The evening breeze brushed over the river's surface, and the flower lanterns drifted downstream like scattered stars. Looking at this man who had remembered me for half his life, I suddenly realized that the seeds of some fateful connections are planted long ago, just waiting for time to let them blossom and bear fruit. 3 years later, news came from Chang'an that Princess Mirong had remarried. When Zhou Jin heard the news, he was holding his daughter, teasing her to say "Daddy." The way he peeked at me was so obvious, it made the baby in his arms giggle. How about we go to the county town the day after tomorrow to check out the new storefront? I took our daughter and pinched his reddening earlobe. His eyes lit up at once, and he started gesturing excitedly as he talked about knocking through to the shop next door and hiring 2 more embroiderers. The setting sun shone through the window paper, dancing between his brows, dyeing all the fine, tiny hairs golden. It rained during the night. Zhou Jin was afraid I'd kick off the covers, so he specially added a fleece blanket. His rough fingertips unconsciously caressed the ends of my hair, calloused from years of separating embroidery threads, warm and reassuring. Sleep now. He gently patted my back. I'll steam date paste cakes for you tomorrow morning. The sound of the rain grew heavier, and as I leaned on his shoulder, I suddenly realized my memory of Shen Yangqing's face had already blurred. Those entanglements I once thought were carved into my heart, ultimately, were no match for the day-after-day warmth from the person by my side. Number side story. Shen Yangqing. When I was 11 years old, the entire Shen family was wrongly accused. Before father was led to the execution ground. He gripped my hand tightly, his nails nearly digging into my flesh. Yanqing, remember, the Shen family did not collude with foreign enemies. Later, I was sold into slavery, picked over like livestock. Until that petite girl, clutching a bag of broken silver, took my hand under the contemptuous gaze of the broker. Her hand was warm with rough calluses on her palm, yet it was the first time I felt that I was still alive. At first, I was just grateful to her. She gave me food to eat, clothes to wear, and even pawned the silver hairpin her mother left her to buy me brushes, ink, paper, and an inkstone. I hid in the woodshed to practice writing, my fingers frozen red, and she would secretly stuff hot soup to me, saying, "I've already eaten," while her own stomach was empty. But gradually, I discovered that I wanted to do more than just repay her. When she smiled, her eyes would curve into crescents, like fireflies by the river on a summer night. When she was angry, she would puff out her cheeks, like a squirrel hoarding pine nuts. When she embroidered, she always liked to bite her lip. And her focused expression was very beautiful. Looking at her, a place in my heart felt like it was being soaked in warm water, slowly melting away. But I didn't dare to say it. I am the son of a disgraced official, a person bearing guilt. If I were discovered, her entire family would be implicated because of me, so I could only restrain myself. Only be gentle but distant to everyone. Only pretend that my feelings for her were no different from my feelings for others. I studied with all my might. In the dead of winter, when my fingers cracked from the cold and blood seeped into the paper, I would wrap them tightly with cloth strips and continue writing. In the sweltering heat of summer, when I was covered in red, swollen mosquito bites, I would soak my feet in cold water to stay awake. She would always brew medicine for me with an aching heart, nagging, "Shen Yangxing, take a rest." I didn't dare to rest. I want to pass the imperial exams, clear the injustice against the Shen family, and stand by her side, openly and honorably. Later, I became the top scholar. In the Golden Throne Hall, His Majesty asked me what reward I wanted. I knelt on the ground, my forehead pressed against the cold golden bricks. "I, your subject, wish to ask for justice." But I didn't expect that Princess Murong would take an interest in me. I couldn't afford to offend her, at least not now. So, when she handed me the letter with a beaming smile, I could only respond with polite aloofness to placate her. I thought I could control everything. I even planned that after number, after I had secured my footing, I would marry Han Qing with great pomp and ceremony. But I forgot that a person's heart can't wait. That day, the princess wrote in her letter, "This princess is angry, and I don't want to talk to you anymore." I panicked. Not because I was afraid she no longer loved me, but because I was afraid she would take her anger out on Han Qing. So I stayed up all night, scouring through ancient books, trying to find a way to appease her. The next day, I made a special trip to give her a gift. The princess was very happy, and I breathed a sigh of relief. But I never expected that Han Qing would see those letters. What I expected even less was that she would leave. On the wedding night, when I lifted the bridal veil and saw it was the princess, I felt as if my whole body had been plunged into an icy cavern. "Where is Han Qing?" My voice was so hoarse it didn't sound like my own. The princess smiled charmingly. "She sold you to me, took the money, and went back to her hometown to marry." I rushed out like a madman, but was held back firmly by the guards. The princess threatened from behind me, "Lord Shen, if you escape the wedding now, tomorrow the whole of Chang'an will know. And what kind of end will that village girl you can't stop thinking about meet?" My blood grew cold inch by inch later. I spent 3 years making the princess pay the price for what she had done. She was no longer that high and mighty, pampered princess, and I could finally openly ask for news of Han Qing. I heard she opened an embroidery workshop. I heard she married an honest and dutiful cloth merchant. I heard she gave birth to a daughter whose eyes and brows looked just like hers. I stood on the Wangyu Tower in Chang'an, gazing at the southern sky, and remembered that year when she looked up and asked me, "Shen Yangqing, will you always stay with me?" I didn't answer at that time. Now I want to say it. But there is no one to ask anymore.